The only reason this project can exist is thanks to your support. So if you have the means and want to uphold the delivery of free online content on the academic study of Esotericism, please consider pledging to my Patreon, sending one-off PayPal donations, or joining the channel as a member. All links in a pinned comment.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Angela Puca and welcome back to my symposium. As you know, I'm a PhD and a university lecturer, and this is your online resource for the academic study of magic, paganism, esotericism, and all things occult. Today I have a super special guest here with me. We are still in Pisa for the conference of the European Association for the Study of Religions at the University of Pisa. And I have here the pleasure of introducing you Dr. Bernd-Christian Otto.
Yep.
From the University
of Leipzig.
Leipzig. I was very scared of mispronouncing it, but I will put it on screen. Bernd has published extensively on topics related to magic and in the field of esotericism. In fact, I will be putting on screen a few of his publications, and also don't forget to check the info box, because as always you will find his publications and his website and contact details. So yeah, I'm really happy to have you here. Thank you so much for being on my symposium.
Thanks for having me. Great opportunity.
Yeah, and you also delivered a paper on the resilience of magic, and I have been following your work on the conceptualization of magic, and we also had conversations which obviously you weren't part of, but we had a couple of conversations on the concept of magic. So I guess the first question that I'd like to ask you is about the concept of magic. According to your study and your research, how did we develop the understanding of magic that we have today? Yeah, how the concept of magic developed over time?
That's a tough question to begin with. So maybe I sketch out a bit my own process of engaging with the concept of magic.
Sure.
So I started maybe 15 years ago with the question why nobody was actually able to define magic. Mm-hmm. That was my very first question while I was still a student, and there were so many theories and definitions of magic, so I was quite puzzled. And then that was actually my master thesis. I started, instead of defining magic or theorizing magic, I started to historicize magic, so to actually write a history of the term. And that's what I then later did in my PhD thesis. It's a German book, a big German book, which I published 2011. Mm-hmm. And what I attempted there was actually to circumvent the problem of defining magic by going through the history of the concept of magic, so the conceptual history of magic, Begriffsgeschichte in German. And instead of trying to find a semantic core or a unifying principle, to do the exact opposite, namely to sketch out the extreme heterogeneity of the concept of magic over time. And in that book I started basically with the Persian Magush, so this high priest during the Achaemenid Empire, which was then Grecicized into Magos around 500 before Christ in classical Greece by authors such as Herodot, Euripides, and maybe poets and philosophers. And that's where the story began. So magic started in the Western history as a concept of, so to speak, the priest of the enemy. Okay?
The priest of the enemy.
Yes, the Persians were at war with the Greek city-states, the Persian Wars, the famous Persian Wars. And Herodotus' account of the Persian Wars is actually our first fully fledged account of the Persian magicians, which were priests in that case, which performed like rites for the kings and all sorts of rites also during the Persian Wars. And quite quickly, 1 or 2 generations later, the term magician became like a bad word in Greek. So if you wanted to offend someone or discredit someone, you used that particular term, which used to be the priest of the enemy. But now suddenly there were these wandering ritual specialists or wandering around the Greek city-states that offered ritual services to like rich citizens of Athens, for instance, to purify themselves and to have advantages in the afterlife. And suddenly they were also called magicians, but in a negative polemical way. And that's basically where the conceptual history started, as a polemical history, an anti-magical history. So the term was used to others, and very quickly also, already during the classical Greek period, three big anti-magical stereotypes emerged, namely one, magic is anti-religious, so it's blasphemy, it's not religion, it's the opposite of religion. Two, it's non-efficacious, so it does not work. And three, it's antisocial. And these three stereotypes are as old as the conceptual history of magic. And they run through the history of through Western cultural history until today, I would say. So there are still anti-magical polemics going on now. For instance, when you consider the book burnings of Harry Potter books in the Bible Belt during the early 2000s, it's still the same way of thinking, and there is also an intercultural anti-magical debate, you could say. There are also anti-magical polemics in Islamic and in Jewish history, and these are also interrelated, all these polemics. So that's part of the story, okay? Part of the history of magic, or the conceptual history of magic, is that there is a massive anti-magical discourse going on from the classical Greek period until today. And then, at some point, a second story emerged. Because suddenly, and this begins much earlier than many people think, people started to identify with the term magic, and also to begin with the word magic, and then also all sorts of ritual practices associated with that term, and started to call themselves magicians. And the first corpus of sources where we actually have this is the Greek magical papyri, so late ancient Egypt. Suddenly we have tons of texts, ritual texts, where people start claiming that they are actually magicians and practicing magic. And this is quite interesting in itself, because it's almost 1,000 years after the polemical use started off. So we might say that the positive or the identificatory use of magic started significantly later or after the polemical use. But then it goes on. So from the Greek magical papyri onwards, we have a continuous history of people identifying with the term, people doing practices that they call magic. And this history was actually the topic of my second big project. After I wrote the conceptual history, the German book, I started to focus exclusively on these, what I call self-referential magicians, and tried to reconstruct this history of their, I call it a tradition, I call it a textual ritual tradition, because for a long time you only have texts and rituals, because it was forbidden. You have only pseudonyms, and you can hardly reconstruct practitioners, but you have the texts and you have the rites. And I call this tradition Western learned magic. And this is a fascinating tradition, fascinating history. I started to work on that, so maybe 7 years ago, and wrote quite a few case studies on aspects of this textual ritual tradition of Western learned magic. For instance, I studied a huge collection of manuscripts of learned magic that today sit in the University Library of Leipzig. In fact, so it's 140 handwritten manuscripts from the early 18th century, many of them translated into German, and I wrote a book about this collection, for instance, and I also worked on medieval manuscripts, also a bit on Arabic stuff, so there is an intercultural exchange going on basically throughout the whole history. And recently, over the past years, I have worked a lot on contemporary practitioners and try to kind of sketch out a bit the modern history of magic. Today it's often spelled with a K, and many scholars would maybe consider it to be a new religious movement or belonging to New Age or modern spiritualities. But when you look at the sources and when you have a long-term perspective, it is part and parcel of this long-term tradition of Western learned magic. For instance, let's take for instance Stephen Skinner. He works with the Goetia. Stephen Skinner is a contemporary practitioner, and the Goetia was edited in 1904 by Aleister Crowley, but the text itself in fact goes back to the mid-16th century. That's where basically the text for the first time is graspable, but parts of the text go back to the 13th century and are clearly derived also from Arabic and Jewish manuscript sources. And these in turn, they have relations to the Greek magical papyrus. So it is really a fascinating history of continuity of certain things, but also a lot of changes. And this is one of the core aspects of my own historical work, is to not reconstruct the history of Western learned magic as something that is always the same in green, as we say in German, das gleiche in grün. No, it changes all the time. It's extremely adaptive, it's extremely flexible, pragmatic. Magicians have always been on top of their, I don't know, culture. They observed what's going on. They were always highly adaptive, and usually Western learned magic was an elitist tradition. I mean, it still today is. Many practitioners have university degrees. It's not about irrationality here, okay?
Many are watching
yes.
An academic YouTube channel, so.
But it was the same in pre-modern times. So that's why I call it learned magic, because it's a textual tradition, and until the 19th century or maybe mid-18th century, only 5% of the population could write, depending on the milieu or the country where you look at. And in fact, these texts are so highly complex. You often have to have multi-language competencies, and you need to have time to practice, like 18 months of Abramelin or I don't know, what have you. And you need resources to create all these nice tools and ropes and swords. So it's a rich man's thing, we might say.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that all practitioners are always rich. Actually, when you look into the modern history of magic, it seems to be the opposite.
Yeah, I mean,
so money magic seems to be one of the most difficult disciplines.
But what about witchcraft? Do you, because usually, like in witchcraft and folk witchcraft, they actually use, very mundane things, like herbs and things that you would find in the kitchen. Yeah. So I guess that you're referring more to the ceremonial.
Yes.
Aspect.
Some people call that ceremonial magic. I call it learned magic, and I would try to indicate that this is a textual tradition. Okay. So I'm not focusing on oral traditions, which have always been around, okay? And there is always a mutual exchange and mutual influences, but these are hard to reconstruct because we don't have any basis for reconstructing pre-modern oral traditions, We often only have descriptions from the outside, which are often polemical. And only in Western learned magic we have, as it were, descriptions from the inside, from the practitioners themselves who wrote it down. And therefore, of course I'm interested in the history of witchcraft, also the persecution history, which is, I mean, fascinating from a historical viewpoint, and it's also fascinating when you interrelate the history of the witch hunts or witch persecutions to the history of Western magic, because both had a peak at the same time. So when you think of the Hexenhammer being published, I think in 1486, and almost exactly in the same year, Massimo Ficino published De Vita Libri Tres, which is like the foundational work of the early modern discourse on Magia Naturalis, which then kind of completely captured the mind of humanists for almost a century. So many people were publishing about Magia Naturalis, thinking that finally we have found kind of a fundamental force in nature, which they called Magia Naturalis, and which is the force that makes the lodestone attract metal, that makes seeds develop into flowers, and maybe also which makes the wandering stars move across the sky. And actually, I mean, in the history of ideas, some people say that Magia Naturalis is like the predecessor of Scientia Naturalis, so there was a gradual development. And it's just interesting to see that at the time of the peak of the witch hunts, which is between 1480 and maybe 1620, exactly at the same time we have these very learned humanists talking about magic all the time, often also under dangerous conditions. And the final example is, of course, Giordano Bruno, but Marcello Ficino, for instance, and Agrippa of Nettesheim, they had to defend themselves sometimes, but they kind of got out of it, even though they published really strong stuff, I would say.
Yeah. So Tommaso Campanella.
Yeah. So this is interesting, and this also indicates that this learned discourse was, of course, a male thing. Okay. And the witch stereotype was rather female and rather illiterate. So we have two different notions here going on at the same time, which are, however, strongly related, of course. Yeah.
And also this idea that you were mentioning about the fluidity of magic and how adaptive it is, reminds me of one of the concepts that you talk about in your work, which is magic as a floating signifier. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah. So when I started working on the conceptual history in my German book, I started off with the hypothesis that magic is an empty signifier.
Which comes from Foucault, I guess.
Yes, Foucault and Derrida, and I thought that magic actually means nothing because it means so many things, and it changes its meaning all the time depending on the speaker and the context and the discourse he or she belongs to. So I was kind of overwhelmed and thought, oh well, let's just argue that magic is an empty signifier, and let's just discard the term, you know, even as scholars. Everybody uses it, but we should not use it because it's so difficult to grasp. But then I changed my mind almost 180 degrees over the last 10 years, I would say, and my compromise would be that it's a floating signifier, which still basically says the same thing, namely that magic can change its meaning depending on the context all the time, but still there are structures of stability which you can actually pinpoint and reconstruct, and these are not arbitrary. So there are fixed meanings, as I said in the polemical discourse. There are these big three stereotypes which are almost constant over 2.5 millennia, and they don't even change. It's always the same, I don't know, boring accusation. So here we have some clear stability, but the even more interesting thing is when you look at the practicing magicians, what they understand under magic from late antiquity over the, let's say, Arabic Middle Ages, early modern times, then maybe 18th, 19th century when the Enlightenment kicks in, and then of course from the late 19th century onwards when the so-called, it was never a revival according to my perspective. I think it just went through. But yeah, things changed in the 19th century, and then in the modern time, there's so much different, there are so many different ritual techniques, groups, currents, that it's obviously highly heterogeneous and changeable all the time, and I find it very interesting to look at this history as a history of change and also a history of innovations, ongoing innovations. So you can actually trace innovations almost every 50 years in pre-modernity. Okay, so it starts off in the Greek magical papyri as an art of conjuring spirits, and the spirits are a vast array of gods, and you have all sorts of basic techniques, which of course continue, but then in the Arabic Middle Ages you suddenly, or quite quickly, have a completely different idea, that namely that you draw down the power of the stars in an almost mechanical manner into an object, which is then the talisman. There you don't need any spirits, and so it goes on. You have alphabets of caracteres, these weird ring letters, suddenly kicking in at some point, and then many techniques over the centuries, fascinating complexity and heterogeneity of techniques, especially in the Leipzig collection, which I mentioned previously. There are so many different recipes, it's just overwhelming again to even map and typologize this heterogeneity. It is possible, and I find this the most interesting thing to do, because then magic is not just a label that you kind of clutch onto something indicating that it's weird, but in fact it is extremely multifaceted and has tons of sub-techniques and sub-schools. And I mean, especially then in the modern period, you have group formation, which really kicks in the 19th century, with the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and the Martinist Order, and maybe the Fraternitas Saturni, and all these other groups. This is also an innovation. It's a social innovation. Suddenly a magician's group. I would say for the most part of the history of Western magic, it was rather a soloist thing. Okay, in the historical sources, in the pre-modern sources, it is hard to detect groups or even only teacher-pupil relations. You can sometimes find instances, but it's not what it's about. But then in the 19th century, group rituals are developed kind of out of the blue or from scratch, like what Mathers did with the rituals of the Golden Dawn. I mean, they basically invented them, and then many other groups followed and wrote their own rituals. And this is also a very interesting innovation. There's tons of modern innovations. I could talk about this for hours, but I make a break here.
You also, keeping up with the theme of the conference, which is about resilient religions, you gave a paper on the resilience of esotericism.
Yeah.
So
magic in particular.
Yeah. I was thinking about our panel, which was on resilient esotericism, but you gave a paper on the resilience of magic. So can you tell us a bit more about that? How come magic is so resilient, even though, you know, we live in a society, and we have been living for a very long time in a society where magic is not particularly welcome? How come it still exists and persists?
Now, that's a good question. That was actually the topic of my lecture yesterday here.
That's why I'm asking.
Yes, and it's also an interesting question that has kind of occupied my mind for a bit, because there has been a debate in the study of Western esotericism why magic survived the disenchantment of the modern world. That's a famous article written by Walter Hanegraaff in 2003. He basically formulated the question for quite a few people who then also wrote about this, and they developed different answers, I would say. And one particularly I would say, successful theory is the so-called psychologization of magic. So magic survives the secularization, whatever it is. I mean, in academia, there is no consensus as to what secularization actually is, and
or whether it actually occurred.
Whether it actually happened or how it happened. But that's another story.
Yes.
Now, for instance, there is a famous fieldwork by Tanja Luhrmann, Persuasions of the Witchcraft, from 1989. She was one of the first anthropologists who did fieldwork in Britain among Wiccans and also followers of Diane Fortune, Fraternity of the Inner Light. And she formulated the interpretative drift theory, claiming that practitioners start practicing and then kind of their whole worldview and mindset changes step by step. They start checking whether the rituals might have worked or not, and they kind of discard negative.
What doesn't work?
Negative data, and kind of begin to filter, and she calls this interpretative drift. And
so you mean that they kind of discard the things that are not in accordance with their belief system?
Yes, it's like a gradual process. That's how she explains how you can actually start believing in magic, even if it doesn't work.
By ignoring the times it didn't work.
Yeah, I'm exaggerating a bit. She's more open also to the emic perspectives, but in the end it comes down to the idea of self-delusion in one way or the other. And this is not my impression. That's also why I work on this, because I've also worked on chaos magic, and I know quite a few practitioners. I've talked to them, and these people don't delude themselves. As you probably all know, because you watched her video on chaos magic, chaos magicians, they are highly akin to science and experimentation and systematic approaches. They all write ritual diaries since the 1970s, so there's tons of actually data. And they they're even forced to write down negative results, because that helps you improve the technique. Chaos magicians didn't invent that, because that was already recommended by Aleister Crowley, who was like very experimental, very systematic. He wanted to kind of throw out the religionist stuff and really turn it into a science, even though he's also ambivalent, because he has religion or religionist aspects in his understanding of Aiwass and his holy guardian age, etc. That's also a longer story. But the point is, the psychologization, as I then thought, is certainly one process which is important. Also, when you look at sigil magic, it's a completely secularized technique, and you even only take your wish and use the letters and rearrange the letters, and then you suck it into your subconsciousness and believe that it works. This is a purely 20th century psychological technique. It's an invention of the modern period, clearly. Already as Austin Osman Spare conceptualized it. And that's that. I think I lost my track. You have psychological
so the reasons
techniques,
why,
psychologized
the reasons
magic.
why
But then I thought, no, that's not the whole story. When you look at the modern history of magic, and I attempted to map the multiplicity of groups, currents, practitioners. It's an ongoing project. And then when you look at the groups, the majority of them, they are not psychologized. They clearly believe in the external reality of certain spirits. So there's a religious element there, which is, that's one of the core, maybe demarcation lines. Do you believe in the external reality of a spirit, or do you think it's only an aspect of your psyche, or even only a brain process, as even Crowley himself suggested? But still, there are many modern practitioners who believe in the external reality of magic. There are many so-called traditionalists who just think that as older a grimoire is, the better, because it's more authentic and more efficacious. There are very well-known traditionalists such as Frater Acher or Joseph Lisiewski maybe, also Stephen Skinner and others. And there are groups who clearly have a religious agenda, I would say. So there is psychologization, but there is also enchantment or re-enchantment, as modern scholars also would maybe say. So secularization comes, there is something out there, but then there is a backlash or a reaction in many modern people to stick to religion, and this also happens in the realm of magic. So there are many religionist groups, traditionalist groups. For instance, Martinists, they practice their rituals as they were in the 18th, 17th century, or even earlier, Freemason-based, before secularization ever happened. So then I would say there is an ambivalency. Some people like the tradition, and from this perspective, magic just went through. When you look at these groups, it is a continuous history, and secularization didn't even change much. So you have many traditionalist magical groupings. You have today people practicing medieval astral magic, people practicing stuff from the Greek magical papyri or the Picatrix. So people find it attractive to try out this stuff. And so this is not psychologization. Yes. So here are already two sides of the coin, but the coin has even more sides, because then there is also clearly something like popularization, of course, in the 20th century. So magic gradually enters mainstream culture or subcultures, or what Christopher Partridge would call occulture. More and more fantasy literature over the course of the 20th century, with like a peak in the past 2 decades, starting with Harry Potter. So Harry Potter was clearly a global game changer. Harry Potter valorized magic, even in a very basic everyday language way. So magic is probably the most used trigger word in advertisements since the late 90s. When you enter Amazon.com and choose the category of electronic products, enter magic, you have 50,000 computer products that have magic in the product title. This is a new thing, okay? Magic is so positive, we have a positive feeling that marketing specialists use it to tap onto our guts, our feelings. And this is completely new, and this is also interesting from the perspective of the polemical discourse and the identificatory discourse, which I still differentiate. The polemical discourse, I would say the anti-magical discourse, was dominant throughout most of Western history, maybe even until the mid-20th century, I would say. But then in the 50s, 60s, maybe starting with Lord of the Rings, but then especially the hippie movement and the feminist movement and all these movements from the 1960s, when they started to proclaim that Gandalf should be the president, a magician should be, a wizard should be the president, things changed, and it became even more severe with Harry Potter. And today I would say that the discourse of the positive discourse, the identificatory discourse, is now dominant, at least in pop culture. It is still difficult for practicing magicians, to run around in their robes.
Or say to their, boss, I practice magic.
Exactly.
It's not something that is acceptable.
Yes, it is still, I would say it changes slowly, but it is still for some people necessary to live a double life, But I would say in the big culture, from the bird's eyes perspective on the development of this, I would say that these are unique times. So for the first time in Western history of magic, also conceptual history, the positive discourse has become dominant. And this is quite fascinating. This is also an interesting thing to think about. Why is it so now? How could Harry Potter be so successful, you know? And yeah, and this is also another explanation which I tried to present yesterday when talking about the resilience of magic. Magic in the 20th century was able to tap onto something like Zeitgeist, you know. It reflects many aspects of how modern society is developed in total in the 20th century, at least in the West. What is often considered as modern or modernity is experimental approach, focus on the self-empowerment, detraditionalization, privatization of religion, individualization, everything that you can find in modern spiritualities, new religious movements, New Age. It's all this aspect that people that religion becomes much more individual, much more self-focused, self-improvement, and magic is like the perfect manifestation of this. It's still at the margins. It's still maybe considered to be weird even by New Ages, who kind of fear power, or maybe they would say it's egocentric. Yeah, and I think that's also, I mean, magic and modernity, they actually make a good match. That was one of my claims. There is no reason to argue that magic fades in modernity, or that there's a decline of magic, or that there's even a disenchantment going on, Entzauberung, you know, in the sense of Max Weber. So many scholars might have assumed that in the early 20th century, or even still in the mid-20th century, but it clearly did not happen. To the contrary, magic is alive and well. It's still not super huge, okay? We're talking maybe about a few million people. When you count Wicca as a magical group, which I do, because Wicca is just embedded in the history. Wicca is just embedded in the history of Western learned magic. So Gardner was a pupil of Crowley, and his rites, he implemented rites from the tradition of Western learned magic. Then, of course, many things developed further on its own right, but so Wiccans maybe, depending on the counting, 1 to 2 million adults, and then that's quite a lot. The other groups, they are not so big. OTO, for instance, as far as I know, has 4,000 active members worldwide now, which is small. It's very present in the scene, but when you actually look at the members, not so much. So from the viewpoint of the history of religion, or Religionswissenschaft, study of religion, this is a small movement. I'm not saying that magic will conquer the world, but it survives at the margins of modern spirituality, and maybe it grows, but it does not decline.
Yeah, I say one of the interesting things about magic and magic practitioners is that it's not solely reducible to the numbers, because even, you know, a small number of people can be very influential.
Yes.
Beyond, you know, the numbers themselves. And another thing, it was really interesting what you just said about, you know, when you type in magic in the section of electronics on Amazon, you find lots of things come up. And that made me think that actually you have so many magic or witchcraft themed products now, you know, even makeup, or I don't know, there are lots of things like or even clothes and bags, and so I think that perhaps there's, apart from the magic practice, so the fact that you said, because I was thinking when you said this is the first time in history that magic has become positive, you know, the positive idea of magic has become prevalent.
Yes.
That made me think, that is not only true for the practitioners, but also for the culture in general, because
Yes.
for instance, with social media, there is also the rise of certain aesthetics. They become like subculture almost. So you have like a lot of these aesthetics based on witchcraft and magic, even on Instagram and TikTok and on social media more generally. And so they also, in a way, contribute to putting magic in a positive light to the culture at large. And so it's like, you know, magic is not only being portrayed positively by practitioners, but also by, you know, those who are not really practitioners, but just have a sympathy in a way for magic. Even in music, and, you know, there are many different ways in which magic has become, pervasive in a more positive light.
Yeah, it seems to have become more and more, right? So over the past decades, this process has kind of taken over whole subcultures, which is what Christopher Partridge calls occulture. It's like the merging of previously esoteric, hidden traditions with pop culture. So it's really a pop thing, but it is of course a resilience process, because the more established these things become, and the more they become part of a symbolic language which is used in everyday culture, the more likely it is that it stays and flourishes, and that actually people become interested in doing the real thing. So it started with of course, many start with literature or movies or television series,
TV shows.
like Buffy or
Now there's
Sabrina. And there has never been made thorough research on this, but a few people have realized that these series alone, Buffy and Sabrina, they have heightened the number of people who asked Wiccan and neo-pagan groups if they could participate. And I think
or Charmed as well.
Charmed, and then came Harry Potter, and today magic is all over the place in television and also in computer games. And as far as I know, so I know a few scholars who have done field work and who have done interviews, and usually what the practitioners say is that they got into it through this series or this even computer game. They became interested, and only, I would say, the minority says, oh, I've started reading Crowley. So this is rather the exception. How would you come across Crowley? I mean, we're still trained in regular schools where Crowley is not part of the curriculum, and where magic is not considered to be something which works and which could kind of enrich your life. So it's always this kind of a secondary socialization, and the more pop culture there is around, the more likely it is to attract people. And I think this process accelerates, and now we have like the first generation of grown-ups who have read Harry Potter in their childhood. So let's see what happens now, you know. The assumption would be that that the community grows, I would say, or modern magic thrives. But I don't know. There is not enough research, especially not on the contemporary developments. It's also so much material.
There are so many traditions
and groups and there's so much literature and websites, and I tried this a bit to map this, but it's even difficult for one person to do it.
You would need like specialists in every single subsection.
Oh no, who pays for that? But I mean, it's even big data. Okay, from a scholarly perspective, it's so much data that you actually have to handle it in. You cannot handle it in a classical way. Just like collecting, writing papers, and then you have a cardboard It doesn't work like that anymore.
Yeah, that's very true. So we will see what happens in the future. Definitely, I feel very encouraged because the panels on esotericism at this conference, at the European conference, were very well attended, and I really enjoyed all of the papers. So, I don't know how representative this conference is of the field at large, but it seems promising. That perhaps the field of esotericism is growing, and hopefully in the future we will have more research and more university willing to pay scholars to study these kind of things.
So I would say the field is growing. So I'm also in the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism, and the conferences, they grow every year, I would say, more or less. And so there is something going on. The academia opens up, I would say. And my impression is that this is also speeding up a bit. More positions, more people interested, more PhD students. Yes, that's Zeitgeist. This is just it reflects the popularity in the population, is reflected by the scholarly field, which is of course exactly what it should be like. So we should study what's going on out there, right?
Yeah.
I think when we look at the study of magic in particular, I would also say that since the last 30 years there was an extreme acceleration of research in all disciplines, especially history. So suddenly classicists who have neglected the sources for like 50, 60 years, in the 90s they suddenly start doing one conference on ancient magic after the other. And also in medieval history, in Egyptology, even in Judaism studies, Islamic studies, they also start now, like the past 10 years. So in all these disciplines, more and more study of magic, but it's still very historical. And what I'm actually waiting for is that there's also sooner or later, or at some point, also more psychological study, anthropological study, and maybe even in some weird future experimental studies, evidence-based study of magic. Why not? So many people have alleged successes with sigils, so why not sit 30 people in a room, let them draw sigils and have an experimental setting and see what happens? I'm open to that. But in academia, this would be maybe even a paradigm shift. Academia constituted itself maybe even in explicit neglect of magic. So science is not magic, and modernity is not magic, but so many people practice magic.
And they are still modern.
Yes, they're modern, they're educated.
They are educated.
They are certainly not always self-deluding individuals. So there's much more to explore, I would say.
Definitely.
Yes.
And on this positive note, I guess that we can end our interview here. And thank you so much for this interview, Bernd. I think it was fantastic. So much
great
information. Yeah, I'm sure that my audience is gonna love it. But obviously, don't forget to leave us a comment in the comment section, because I definitely want to know what you think about what we said, especially what Bernd said. And thank you again.
Thank you, Anjana. That was fun. Thanks for the invitation, and have fun watching. Okay.
Thank you for watching.
Thank you for watching. You just watched it.
Indeed. Thank you for sticking up to this point.
Okay.
Bye for now.
Bye.